Well, hello everyone. I'm back. It's been a long time. I've followed all your comments, and I see Vilnius is in the house. Vilnius, can you just let me know that you can hear me okay? Just hearing feedback there from my own phone, so it looks like that's good. What I'll do is I'm going to share my PowerPoint. It's been a while, so hopefully I'll get it first time. No. Probably just going to take a second to get the hang of this again. Unfortunately, I don't seem to be able to get my see if this is working. No. Okay, let's just see if this is let's wait till it just give it a moment just to see that the PowerPoint is showing correctly. Doesn't appear to be working. Oh, okay, let's try something else. Okay. For some strange reason, this option didn't come up the first time. Okay, so I don't have a whole lot of time. I'm trying to squeeze this in, have a meeting in about 25 minutes. But in any case, where was Muhammad buried? Big question. According to the standard Islamic narrative, he was poisoned by a Jewish cook. He later died and was buried in Medina. This is what we've heard for years. But obviously, based on everything that we've discovered over the past couple of years, we don't believe either of these things are true. But what about Muhammad? As we've set out already over numerous videos, we believe that Umar and Muhammad are one and the same person, not least because all contemporary sightings of him in the process of conquering Israel occur 2 years after the Islamic tradition says Muhammad died. These early reports trump any late 8th or early 9th century claims as to the biographical details of his life. So what we believe is that Muhammad and Umar are one and the same person, and his career, if you like, really started in 634 all the way to 644 when he died. So that's really who we're looking for and where he was buried. Now, Umar is meant to be buried also in Medina, but I don't think that's true either. This thesis assumes that Umar had time to plan for his funeral arrangements and made his will clear in this regard. So it's assuming that given he had time to make those arrangements, where would be the most likely, the most apt place for him to be buried, considering everything that we know in relation to the Jerusalem thesis? It's obvious that Umar was obsessed with the Temple Mount, based on, again, all the work that Paul Ellis has done and the work on this channel. As Paul Ellis has set out, the Masjid al-Haram is the Temple Mount, or perhaps more precisely, the Masjid made of wood that Umar built on the Temple Mount in the late 630s, having conquered Jerusalem. As Emperor Leo III stated, Umar was one of the writers of the material that became the Quran. This masjid, the masjid, was central to his preaching, and the plan at the time of his writing in the 630s and 640s was for it to be the focal point of prayer. In other words, the Qibla. Clearly, this never materialized. What I mean by that is the Qibla doesn't appear to be pointing towards Jerusalem. If we look at the early mosques, there may be some exceptions to that, but in general, they don't seem to be pointing there. We don't have much evidence for mosques directed towards Jerusalem. There is a faint memory in Islamic tradition that it originally faced Jerusalem, but got changed elsewhere in Muhammad's, read Umar's lifetime. So that faint memory might have an element of truth to it. So if we imagine that there was a Qibla towards Jerusalem, when it talks about the change in the Qibla in the Quran, it's actually talking about other Qiblas before that and directing things towards Jerusalem. But then there was a change elsewhere. And that's the memory that the Islamic tradition remembers, which is accurate, actually, as we'll see. So what happened? What's changed? How come Jerusalem didn't remain the focus of the Qibla? I'm going to suggest that this has got a lot to do with the manner of Umar's death and the place that he wanted to be buried. This caused problems for the overall narrative. To figure out what changed, let's recall the last days of Umar's life as commonly accepted. In 644, Omar was assassinated by a Persian slave named Abu Lulu by later accounts. His motivation for the assassination is not clear. One possible explanation was that it was done in response to the Muslim conquest of Persia, another that he had a grievance about the high taxation. In October 644, Umar undertook a Hajj to Mecca, during which the assassins pronounced Umar's imminent death that year, and the massive crowd of the congregation was used by the conspirators as a veil to hide themselves. Piruz Nahavandi, or Abu Lulu, was an ex-Sasanian soldier. To me, it was revenged by the Sasanians. Just checking your messages there. Okay. Now, I don't believe this happened in Mecca of the Hijaz, but in Jerusalem, as this was where Umar was conquering Greater Palestine and Syria during this period. So it makes more logical sense that this occurred again in Jerusalem. Now, on the 31st of October, 644, Piruz attacked Umar while he was leading the morning prayers, stabbing him 6 times in the belly and finally in the navel. That proved fatal. Umar was left profusely bleeding while Piruz tried to flee, but people from all sides rushed to capture him. In his efforts to escape, he's reported to have wounded 12 other people, 6 or 9 of whom later died before slashing himself with his own blade to commit suicide. Perhaps some of this is exaggerated, but the sequence of events sounds realistic, including the long drawn-out death. Umar died of the wounds 3 days later, that's key there, on Wednesday the 3rd of November, 644. If true, Muhammad's death at the hands of a Sasanian soldier, albeit an ex-Sasanian soldier, was a propaganda disaster. Obviously, this is not something that they would have wanted to happen. Let's recall an early alternative tradition of how Muhammad was killed, found in Stephen J. Shoemaker's The Death of a Prophet. Shoemaker argues that these parallel traditions about Muhammad's death must have originated before the period in which Muhammad is depicted as having died and been buried at Medina. So on page 68 he writes, one of these, the Latin Historia de Muhammad, is a brief biography of Muhammad that seems to have come into circulation in Spain sometime prior to the middle of the 9th century, when Eulogius of Cordova incorporated it into his Liber Apologeticus Martyrdom. Interestingly enough, it also seems to present the Islamic conquest of the Roman Near East within Muhammad's lifetime. Now, this would actually mean that, again, Umar and Muhammad must be the same person, because if he died in 632, or at least the traditional Muhammad died in 632, this doesn't work. But if Umar is really Muhammad, then it makes perfect sense. Now, it came into circulation in the middle of the 9th century. Obviously, that looks late, but as we'll see later, Shoemaker shows how this can be traced to a much earlier tradition, actually before the middle of the 8th century, so pretty early, possibly the 7th century. He also says that this report suggests that Muhammad fabricated the Quran, which again fits in with Leo III's point about Umar writing parts of the Quran. Shoemaker writes, "If one did not know any better from reading the accounts of the traditional Islamic sources, one would presumably understand the assault on Syria as also falling within Muhammad's lifespan. Standing squarely at the center of this political vita, the conquest of Syria seems very much to belong among the accomplishments of Muhammad's prophetic career." End quote. This is hard to square with the Abbasid claim that Muhammad died in 632. The Historia's account of Muhammad's death, it explains that when he sensed that death had come upon him, he predicted that he would be resurrected 3 days after his death by the angel Gabriel. Following his death, Muhammad's followers maintained a vigil, guarding his body and awaiting its resurrection. When 3 days later this did not transpire, Muhammad's body began to stink, and his followers convinced themselves that their presence was preventing the angel's appearance. So they left the body alone, and immediately, instead of angels, dogs followed the stench and devoured his flank. His disappointed followers then buried what was left of the body. What might have happened originally? What is the least fantastical version of this story we can imagine? Obviously, we don't or shouldn't take everything on face value. I would suggest that it is possible that the stories of Umar's and Muhammad's demise were originally one and the same. So Umar is wounded, but promises his followers that the angel Gabriel would intervene and save him in 3 days' time, and therefore he assured them that he would recover. Instead, the gangrene took over and ate his flank, i.e. the location where Umar was stabbed multiple times. So I think if you bring these the details of what we know about Umar's death with this tradition that's found among Christians about Muhammad's death, bring the details together, I think this makes perfect sense. So what's this about the dogs and so on? You know, how do we account for this, and why this idea that he might resurrect? So I think the introduction of the dogs motif appears to have come straight from the Bible, 2 Kings 9-10. I will make the house of Ahab like the houses of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, and Baasha, son of Ahijah. And on the plot of ground at Jezreel, the dogs will devour Jezebel, and there will be no one to bury her. So I'm suggesting this accretion came as a result of a Christian polemic against the false prophet Muhammad or Umar. So I think this was just added to the story to basically to reinforce the idea that he was a false prophet. We can imagine in the retelling that instead of his dying and his followers waiting for his resurrection, that this would be the more likely version of what happened, and allows us to see these stories as originating in the same event. So I think a more natural sequence of events is probably that, as in the case of Umar, he was lying in bed for 3 days, he didn't recover, and the gangrene took over. And that's really what happened, despite the fact that he promised that he would recover in 3 days. So there's no resurrection promise or anything like that. So then we turn on to the Bahira version of the story. His followers thought that 3 days after his death, he would go up to heaven to Christ who sent him. Shoemaker writes, when he died, they brought his body to a large house and sealed it inside. 3 days later, they returned only to find that they could not even enter the house on account of the stench of Muhammad's rotting corpse. He goes on, the most striking feature of this alternative account of Muhammad's demise is its indication, in the East Syrian recension at least, that Muhammad's followers do not know anything about his grave, including, one would presume, its location. This feature would seem to suggest a particularly early date for this tradition, sometime before the tradition of Muhammad's death and burial in Medina had become established. And this is very important, that, it's really indicating that there was a different place he was buried, and this tradition is earlier. More to the point is that this brief polemical account seems to recall a time when Muhammad's followers were perhaps uncertain as to the location of his grave. It is difficult to imagine a Christian polemicist fabricating such Islamic ignorance concerning the site of Muhammad's death, particularly if the tradition of his death was well established early on. In other words, if Medina was established from the early days, then this story would never have taken off. It suggests there was a gap in the story, and that this was part of an earlier tradition, which the story of Medina and so on was there to cover up. It adds lateral support to the notion that Muhammad's life may have ended in rather different circumstances than his traditional biographies remember it. And then a third source, the Greek chronicle of Theophanes, beginning of the 9th century. This also reports that Muhammad's life ended with his, quote, slaughter or wounding. He reports this despite the heavy influence of the Islamic narrative at this stage. This element somehow got through. So it seems to suggest that there was something solid to this, considering that elsewhere in his chronicle, he's strongly influenced by the Islamic tradition, which of course, by the beginning of the 9th century was, strongly in place. Again, we ought to note how much the report of Muhammad's death tallies with accounts on Umar's death. So again, it seems to reinforce the idea that Muhammad and Umar are really the same person. Muhammad and Umar are, if we take Muhammad as Umar, it makes sense that the reports in, for example, the other two traditions of Muhammad being involved in the conquest of Palestine and Syria. Well, that was Umar that did that. If Umar or Muhammad had 3 days before he died, if Umar and Muhammad had 3 days before he died to make a decision about where he would be buried, where would he have chosen to be buried? Left that little bit out. Undoubtedly, the most important place for him was the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the place that he called Masjid al-Haram. Jerusalem, again, shouldn't be a surprise, as some Sahaba are buried there, according to Islamic tradition. I'll give you a couple of examples. So we have, for example, Ubadah ibn as-Samit, who was appointed as the first teacher and judge of the Palestinian people by Umar. He is believed to have spent some period of time in the city of Jerusalem, where he's buried in Bab al-Rama cemetery, next to Jerusalem's old city walls. And there you can see the grave and so on. And also Shaddad bin Aus, he's also buried at Bab al-Rama cemetery. Shaddad bin Aus was one of the closer companions of the Prophet according to the Islamic tradition. He's believed to have narrated hadith directly from Nabi Muhammad. So there you go. Now, here's where I think Umar or Muhammad was secretly buried, in a crypt under the Dome of the Rock that became known as the Well of Souls, or sometimes the Cave of Souls. When he died, they brought his body to a large house and sealed it inside. That's according to that Christian tradition. Umar's masjid was referred to in the Quran as the house. See Paul Elsa's videos on this, so this would fit in nicely. Are there any legends associated with Umar or Muhammad's burial on the Temple Mount? This is corroborating evidence here. Muslims believe Muhammad ascended to heaven from the Shakra, the rock. Indeed, they believe he left his footprint there. Well, if he was buried elsewhere, it's hard to explain how he could have ascended to heaven from there. So it fits. It's also the place considered a place where the dead await Judgment Day. The name Well or Cave of Souls derives from a medieval Islamic legend that at this place the spirits of the dead can be heard awaiting judgment. This is consistent with it being used as a crypt. Number 3, Muslims believe that the Sakra is suspended in the air. Sakra is just a word which means rock, so that's rock associated with Islam, with Abraham. They believe that Sakra is suspended in the air, and its only support is a palm tree held by the mothers of the 2 greatest prophets, Muhammad and Abraham. Again, it appears like an apt place for Muhammad or Umar to be buried, as it is held up by a palm tree held by none other than the mothers of Islam's greatest prophets. Number 4, in the cavern below, there is a legend that the most projecting point is called the tongue, because when Umar thought he had discovered the stone which was Jacob's pillar, in his vision at Bethel, he exclaimed, "Es-salamu alaykum," and the stone replied, "Alaykum us-salam wa rahmat ulahi." And apologies for my bad pronunciation of the Arabic, but you get the point. So there's a legend associated with a rock projection in that very cave itself, associated with Umar. Any possible signs he is buried there in an unmarked tomb? Here's a photo taken on the steps leading into this cavern, which is under the Dome of the Rock. Above this ceiling, let's say, is where the Holy of Holies was originally. So it's an important place for Christians, Jews, and Muslims. From the steps at another angle. What is under the carpet? The mosaic pattern suggests that this is a central spot. Can you see the mosaic pattern? There's like a star in the middle, and then there's what appears to be like markings that you'd associate with a compass going around it. So this is a key spot. Was he buried under here, perhaps? Maybe. Under the carpets, there are 2 mosaics of interest, mosaic A and B. Okay, so you can see where they are in relation to the stairs as you come down into the cavern. Mosaic A. So if we look under the carpet, this mosaic strongly suggests that something is contained under this octagonal capstone. But what? You can see that the original space has been cut out and this capstone was put in. Usually things like that contain something underneath. If you go to a Christian altar, you'll see capstones like that, usually containing the relics of a saint, particularly if you go to a Catholic church. The person who has sent me these photos, who I believe has asked me not to reveal who he is, so I won't, has suggested that of the 4 mihrabs which are down here, which I reported on, there's only 2 of them still extant within the cave. So there's been an attempt to hide the various mihrabs here. So there's only 2 of them left. Okay, so that's mosaic A. What about mosaic B? So this is mosaic B. Star at the center seems to suggest this is ground zero. and the surrounding compass-like markings add to that impression. And look at this object in the background. What is this? The one with the pillars and this marble box here, which seems out of place. What is the purpose of this? There's no markings, nothing to indicate what it is. Could this marble niche be the burial place of Umar, aka Muhammad? There seems to be no obvious reason for this structure that is out of place with the rest of the room. Obviously, short of actually digging this up, we'll never know. But I'm going to suggest, if I was a betting person, this would be the first place I would look. So my tentative conclusion, I believe that considering all the legends associated with this location, especially that it marks the spot where Muhammad supposedly ascended into heaven, it's difficult to escape the logical conclusion that this is where Umar or Muhammad was buried. I would suggest that the marble tomb in the corner is where he was left, at least originally. I think the most apt object that may be buried under Mosaic A's capstone was the most important thing associated with Umar, an early copy of his writings, what later became known as the Quran. In reality, these locations, if they ever contained such items, have probably long since been emptied, but wouldn't it be great to find out? So, Jerusalem then could no longer be used as a Qibla. Praying towards the Temple Mount risked turning Muhammad's burial site into a place of veneration, the sin of shirk or idolatry. So a new focal point was necessitated by his decision to be buried there. This would lead to decades of turmoil as his followers wrestled with upholding his last will and testament, while having to justify why a completely different location became the new location for a Masjid al-Haram. So the Abbasids went back to the drawing board. We shouldn't underestimate the huge effort that changing the Qibla required in terms of rewriting the story, covering up all the biblical connections with Jerusalem and so on, and trying to make a new place, Mecca down in the Hijaz, fit. So, is this his burial place? I think so. It will require archaeologists to go and dig it up and see what's there. But this is a bit like prospecting for oil. The evidence would suggest that this is a good location to go looking for that oil. So back to you all. So there you go. That's my thoughts on it. I do have to stop there. I have a meeting to attend, but thank you for watching. I'll talk to you all very soon. Bye-bye.